Well, thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate the chance to talk to you this evening. And what I want to talk to you about is facing Goliath. I want us to look at the account of David and Goliath. I know it's a very familiar story that we all know, but maybe we can look at it a little differently or see some things maybe we don't usually notice or think about. So first, let's look at Goliath. If we look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, which this is, this account, this is all in this chapter, so this is pretty much where we're going to be hanging out. Verses 4 through 7, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. So he wasn't alone, okay? Goliath stood over 9 feet tall, assuming that the cubit was 1.5 feet, which is 18 inches. He was, that is 9 feet there. And then he was also a span. A span is half a cubit, which would be another 9 inches. So he was 9 foot, 9 inches tall. Around close to 10 feet, that's close enough for me, right? If you were rounding up, you'd say 10 feet. His coat of mail weighed about 125 pounds. That's assuming the shekel weight was 0.4 of an ounce. His spearhead weighed 15 pounds, again, assuming that same shekel weight. And the spearhead was on the end of this strong, rounded wooden pole, which was much bigger than a normal person would carry. It was like a small tree, you might imagine. A weaver's beam was a big round pole, not something a normal person would be waving around. So Goliath is this huge, imposing figure. He's very scary, and he's so big and powerful looking, very intimidating. So let's see what Goliath says. If we look at verses 8 through 11 in this same chapter, then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Pardon me. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now Goliath did what he set out to do here. He intimidated the men of Israel, and they were afraid to face him. Now you may wonder, how afraid were they? Well, in verse 16, and the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So they did this for 40 days, over a month. These two armies lined up, and Goliath came out and challenged over and over, twice a day, challenged them to single combat, and the Israelites failed the challenge. Now we know what happens next, and we'll review it here. David convinces Saul to let him face Goliath. Remember, David could not use Saul's armor or sword because he wasn't practiced with them. He wasn't accustomed with them. And they probably didn't fit him very well either because Saul was tall for a Jew. He was one of the taller people. So in verses 40 and 41, this is David. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. So David gets some stones for his sling, and the two men, start to approach each other a little bit. This doesn't mean they're like right on top of each other. They're just starting to move toward each other a little. But close enough to recognize each other and have this exchange that we're going to read about. David is kind of keeping his distance a little. If we look at verses 42 through 44, and when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." So Goliath is not impressed with David at all, so he tries to intimidate David, saying basically, "You're no match for me." And then he dares David, "Come to me, and I will kill you." Then we see David's response in verses 45 through 47. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." So David lets Goliath and everyone else know that the Lord will defeat Goliath. The Lord will deliver him into David's hands. So God will give David the victory. David is just coming in, doing his part, standing in for the Lord. And we know how this ends. We look at verses 48 through 51. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. So we usually look at this as David is this poor, unarmed kid that just did not stand a chance against this giant, this big giant that had the huge spear, the big sword. He even had that helper with him, carrying his shield. So David's out there with a slingshot and a staff against this giant. And, we say that God gives David the victory through this miracle rock and slingshot, and that's kind of right. God does give David the victory. There's no doubt about that. That's a fact. And without God, David would not have had this victory. He would have failed. We know that. But I want us to see how God prepared David for this battle. It was not an accident that David showed up and killed Goliath. It was not a coincidence that David had the skill needed to kill Goliath. So first, I want us to understand the slingshot. When we think of a slingshot like what David had, it was not this type of toy that we had as little kids, right? I mean, that's a fun little toy, and they make pretty good ones nowadays, but this is not what he had. What David had was more like what you see on the left side of this picture. He had a real slingshot. Now, there could have been some minor differences, but in basis, in the basic idea, the basic principle of how it was made, this is pretty much the idea. So, and this was a deadly weapon. Armies would use men, they called them slingers. And kind of like archers, they would use them kind of that way, and they would sling these stones and deal a lot of damage to the opposing army. So I want to share some information this is from ChristianAnswers.net, and the author is Gary Byers, and I'm going to read this here. A good slinger hurled a stone as far and accurately as a good archer. Roman military texts recommended archery target practice at about 200 yards. Slingers are known to hurl their projectiles even farther, as much as 440 yards. Now that, of course, that's not saying that it was totally accurate at 440 yards, but he's just giving the idea of how far that stone could reach, really. So as for accuracy, one ancient writer noted that the best slingers would wound not merely the heads of their enemies, but any part of the face at which they might have aimed. Now that was at a more reasonable distance. That wasn't like 440 yards away, right? Just want to mention that and make sure I'm not exaggerating this to you. But experiments demonstrate that missiles leave a sling in excess of about 60 miles an hour. Now, a bit of trivia regarding the idea of a 60-mile-an-hour stone. For comparison, Brett Favre used to throw a football at 60 miles an hour, and his receivers, sometimes it would break their fingers. Okay, Antonio Freeman said Favre broke 7 of his 10 fingers, and some of them multiple times. That's him throwing a big, soft football at 60 miles an hour. So by comparison, you think of a small, hard stone coming at you at 60 miles an hour. That would be much more dangerous, much worse. So, okay, we also had one Roman writer noted that opponents in leather armor were in far greater danger from sling missiles than arrows. Even if the stone did not penetrate the armor, it was capable, just from the force of the impact, of inflicting a fatal injury to them. So unarmored bodies were easily penetrated by sling stones. An ancient medical book included instructions for removing lead and stone sling missiles from the bodies of wounded soldiers. Because some armies would make consistent stones or metal balls, you might think of, what would we call them, ball bearing type of thing, so that they'd be more deadly, more dangerous. So notice that David picked out his stones, if you remember in our verses, probably all about the same general size and shape that he was accustomed to using. So the slingshot David used was a deadly weapon in the right hands. Now, was David skilled in this weapon? If we look at the evidence, what did David say about himself? When David talked to Saul, he gave this account in verses 34 through 36. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Now understand that David probably spent a lot of time with this sling and practicing. He protected the sheep from predators. There would have been wolves, not just a lion and a bear. There would have been wolves and possibly other predators. He mentioned a lion and a bear because that would be more comparable to something like Goliath. He's trying to impress upon Saul that he would be able to do this. But no doubt, David used his sling to fend off different predators. Most would have probably been smaller and faster than a lion or a bear, and especially someone as big as Goliath. So notice this account, his account here, of what sounds like the lion, because he mentions the beard specifically. He went after it and struck it. Now he struck it with his sling from a distance, and then it wasn't really dead, but it was probably seriously wounded, and then he killed it with his rod or his staff when he was up close on it. So most animals would probably not survive a good hit from a 60-mile-an-hour rock. Probably most of us wouldn't, depending on where it hits us, right? So you might ask, how do I know David used this type of tactic against the lion or the bear? Well, if we remember, when David realized that he couldn't use Saul's armor or sword, he wasn't familiar with them. He wasn't practiced with them. He wasn't an expert in those things. What did he do? He did what he normally did. He went and he got some stones for his sling that he was going to use. That would be like we would go load our gun. That type of idea. So that's what he did here in verse 40. So David was doing what he was practiced in, what he knew, what he was using, what he was familiar with. This was his habit. So David was going to use the same tactic he had used in the past. The same weapon he had used protecting the sheep. He would use that to defend Israel. He was not an expert with swords. But this, he was an expert at. He knew this. He had been practicing this for years. And Goliath was this huge target. And honestly, Goliath never really stood a chance if you think of that as a gun. So David was skilled, and God was on his side. You'll notice in verse 48, they were starting to move close to each other, right? Or closer. The closer they got, as this tells us, they were moving closer to each other. David's shot was easier. He was getting closer for a better shot. And he struck Goliath that deadly blow from a distance. He did get closer to get a better shot, but he didn't move up to where Goliath could easily get a hold of him and kill him. David knew his advantage was not in close combat, and Goliath knew his advantage was. So, of course, he was going to move towards David. I don't know, Goliath doesn't mention anything about the sling. He just talks about the staff, the stick. So I don't know if Goliath really saw the sling until it was too late. But God directed David that day, and David was victorious because of God, definitely. But see, God's planning for David didn't start that day. God's providence had David protecting the sheep, using that sling, way before that day. Let's see, David had battles with also a bear and a lion and other predators. God was preparing David each step of the way, building his faith and his skill with these challenges. It's providence. It's God's providence, and God does that with us. He prepares us to face our challenges, our giants, the troubles we have in this life. The things we go through in life have a purpose. We may not always see it at the time. It's doubtful David knew that he would face Goliath, especially when he was guarding the flock. Maybe he felt like a lot of kids, like he was being put upon, right? Like, well, I just got to be here and tend the sheep. Don't know that for sure, but, it's a young guy. He could have thought that way. But like most young men, he probably dreamed of being like a great warrior with a shield and armor and all that. That's why he at least tried Saul's armor and everything. But God directs us, and he knows what we need, and he arms us for our battles. And most of all, the Lord prepares us to face the predator in this life, who's Satan, as we're told by Peter in this verse, which we all know very well, 1 Peter Chapter 5, verse 8, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Like Goliath, Satan will present himself as a powerful predator. He will try to intimidate. He wants to intimidate us and scare us. And when that doesn't work, then he will try to deceive us. But he can only devour us if we let him. Do not be fooled. He's not seeking to devour whoever he wants to, just only whoever he may devour, who will let him. So the Lord has prepared us. He's given us everything we need for our battles. All these problems and trials we go through, they train us, they strengthen us. We grow our faith through these things. We grow our skills. Like David, we can look back at our past trials and remember that God brought us through those. and he will bring us through whatever our next challenge is. And do not be surprised when the challenges grow, because our faith is growing and we need that next challenge. We need to grow more. We always need to continue growing. So don't back down. Use the skills that God has given you. The Lord is with you. He has been with you all along, preparing you. Use what he's taught you. If the problems of life seem too big, like Goliath, which I'm sure he looked huge, if you feel outnumbered, Goliath had a buddy with him. David didn't have that. It makes no difference to God, though. It doesn't matter how many people there are against you or against him. And don't fight the enemy on the enemy's terms. Goliath wanted David to come to him for a close-up physical match, which he knew he would have won. But David fought Goliath on God's terms, on his terms. So don't be deceived by appearances. Goliath was huge and powerful. He appeared to have every advantage, but the Lord prepares us and gives us the advantage. Just like David said, the Lord will deliver you into my hands. And the lesson is that we're not fighting our giants alone. God is with us and has been with us. He's preparing us for all these things. This is like a one-note lesson, Dave Tenney would say. I have one point. God is preparing us for everything that we face in our life. That's really the whole idea. He has prepared us to do our part. Mainly, our part is to trust in God, trust in his plan for us, trust in the preparation he gives us in our lives. David was victorious because of God. The Lord had prepared him for this battle. So when you meet your enemy, remember God has been preparing you for them. You already know and have what you need. Trust in the Lord. So in closing, I do want us to look at David's attitude here, which was so good. In verses 46 and 47, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. David knew this giant could not stand against the Lord. And David knows here that God is the one facing Goliath. David only took what he needed, what he was practiced in, and what God had prepared him to use. So, if we look at verse 51, again, therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, Goliath, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him. So, Goliath wasn't totally dead, but he killed him and cut his head off with his own sword. So, David had to use Goliath's own sword to behead him. But God has given us his sword. And it's one we should be well practiced in. We should be in God's word every day. If we are not an expert at our weapon, then we're easily disarmed and defeated. Do not be deceived. We need to be immersed in the Bible. God's word is our defense and our weapon. The knowledge it gives us, telling us who we are in Christ, reminding us of the promises of God so that we can stand ready and withstand persecution. It also encourages us and gives us the means to take our life away from Satan and from the temptations we have in this world, and to help others do the same. The Word of God is that sword for us, our weapon against evil. So I want to leave you with this verse. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. The Lord does not save with physical weapons of this earth. The battle is always the Lord's, and he has already defeated Satan and evil. Jesus has given all of them over into our hands. That is the message of the cross, where Jesus defeated all the powers and took everything away from them. It's up to us to stand in his victory and not waver in fear or in temptation. And we must not allow ourselves to be intimidated or deceived. And today, if you need any help standing against anything in your life, or if you need anything that we could pray for you about, we are here for the purpose of helping you. If you need to be baptized, we have water. We can do that. If there's any need that you might have, anything we could help you with, please let us know as we stand and sing 197. 197.